Death, he taught me, was as liable to the world's mechanical mistakes as any other job a wheel could give way and turn a schedule into a chaos that spared or condemned arbitrarily. Can one rearrange such things? I asked, and here my voice betrayed me with its eagerness. It is, I am ashamed to say, a terrible pleasure to hear a path where one had thought only a cliff. One can nudge, he said. One can note a rope and make it fray a day sooner. One can forget a plate and have the carriage leave another hour. But to rearrange a city's notion of certainty is not my trade. If I am to bend anything, it must be small and surgical. He described the way a marginal note could be left where a clerk would see it and interpret it as an administrative statement, a blank that reads like instruction to a man reading with tired eyes. He showed me how the executioner, who must be precise, sometimes relied on annotations left by clerks with tired hands. These marginalia were small openings, the sort by which a seam might be unstitched. There was a tenderness in his voice when he spoke of mistakes as mercy or cruelty. He had learned, in the long practice of seeing people named and numbered, the cruelty of calendaring, a mother who waited and died in the weeks before her child's turn. A man shuffled to some waiting place where hunger did his work before the law could catch up. The executioner's practice, he suggested, contained within it an anatomy of delay, an anatomy that, if one could read its muscles, might be eased. "You mean you will help us?" I asked, and the question was not a courtship. It was the precise mechanical inquiry of a tradeswoman wishing to know the price of an order. He looked wary the way a man looks wary when he has been offered too many absolutions. "I will tell you what I see," he said. "I will tell you when columns are vulnerable to mischief. I will tell you when the wagons are likely to be late. I will mark in my book when the clerk eats with his family and is apt to be more lenient. But to do more would be to make me a conspirator. To make me, that is, to ask me to stand where I have never wanted to stand. Perhaps, I said, because language is deceptive and promises are too easy to make, it is not conspirators the city needs, but a redistribution of attention. If the public names are believed to be immutable because they are written, then a modest correction might teach people to doubt the thing that hands them death. Then you will have to be clever, he said, and when cleverness reaches the level of law, then the law reaches for a rope. We argued about ethics in the kind of shorthand that booksellers and men of metal can share small economies of action, rather than grandiloquent moralities. He told me of another thing a book would not teach, the manner in which the executioner reads the list aloud. He spoke of cadence. A name read slowly with epigraphic gravitas could give the condemned time to say something that might alter a record. The manner of enunciation was a little ritual of dignity. A hurried pronouncement made death a mechanical thunk. A deliberate one could give a person a moment to name a child, to ask for a priest, to pass a note. It was, he said, a power vested in the mouth. He had kept his own journal because the official books did not attend to the human details he recorded when a name was read twice by mistake, and what the clerk said after that. And these notes contained in their smallness a map of leverage. When he slid the book to me across my counter, the world contracted to the size of that trade. I thought for a second, perhaps stupid and savage, of the ledger at home and of how its neat columns would gnaw at a man's throat if he ever had to read his own name. "Take it," the file said. "Not all the world knows how to read wood and rope. You read letters. You might know what to do with marginalia." It was not a gift but an exposure, and that made the taking an act of theft even if we called it negotiation. He asked for nothing in coin. He requested, as a man might request a favor without wanting to seem to ask for it, that I bind his book when the next cold rain came so the pages would not disintegrate. He wanted his private ledger to last, because it is in the making and the keeping of things that a person measures their own life. I promised and added something I had not planned, that if he ever wished to leave that yard, I would find him a quiet job in my shop. The truth was that a place in my bindings would not save him from the tribunal. But an offer named his person as more than his hands. "You must know," he said, as if to test whether my willingness sprang from calculation or pity, "that even a delay can be its own violence. If a name is placed next to another, and the second man is spared because the first was hurried, then we have chosen by default who dies. There is no easy right answer." I thought of Lucy and how small her hands had seemed on the pages she folded into collars. I thought of tea and burning plates, and the way fire simplified the world by taking away the parts that incriminated. I thought also, with an honesty that chilled me, of my own relief at possessing knowledge that might tilt a scale in my favor. In that taking, there was my own complicity, and Theophile saw it in the set of my jaw. "You will do with it what you must," he said. "I have lived long enough to know that knowledge is not kind. It is not a bandage. It is an instrument. People use instruments with hands that tremble. Outside the shop the city had its ordinary noises, a carriage wheel, the sharp call of a hawker, laughter that was being economical with sorrow. Inside, my counter smelled of paste and lemon and that new, dangerous knowledge. I folded the journeyman's book into the inside of my apron as one hides a child's garment, and I felt the shape of it like a pulse beneath my palm. He left without ceremony and left behind the imprint of his coat on the air. I made tea and sat with my ledger open. Words are the tools I trust, and yet here was a craft I did not control but could use. I made notes in a small script the journeyman's pencil could not misread dates when carts were apt to falter, the way particular clerks like to eat at the Pave Rouge, where an informer might anticipate a procession. These notes I folded into false lists and into the margins of books I would send into the city, a cookbook with a penciled appointment here, a child's primer with a slip that suggested a delay there. It was not a wholesale rewriting of fate, it was a series of small falsehoods designed to teach doubt. When Jean Morel came by the shop that afternoon, a man who had the habit of stopping at quiet places to inhale the city's lesser pains, he looked at the book at my belt and then at my face. "You wear it like a wound," he said. I admired him for that candor. He had been useful before in misfiling a warrant or allowing a printed sheet to be delayed on its way to the tribunal. His small acts of mercy had a habit of softening sharp edges. "I have information," I told him. "It will not stop everything, but it will let us breathe in the small hours." He nodded as if he had expected no less. "Be careful," he said, and the words were the most substantial thing he could give me. By the time dusk made the shop crowded with its own shadows, I had done the arithmetic in the way I do best. I calculated routes by which the journeyman's notes might be most destructive to the ledger's authority without exposing the hand that moved them. A counterfeit list distributed on the day a carriage was likely to break might cause the tribunal's clerks to stumble, to question their own certainty. A marginalia planted in a book that a certain clerk would read during a certain hour might be interpreted as official. These were not theatrical revelations but tradcraft, the narrow knowledge of workers who service big machines. Yet even as I planned, dread sat at the back of my throat. The journeyman had told me that a delayed name is sometimes a mercy and sometimes a postponement of horror. To delay was not to save. It was to buy time in which other miseries could befall. I was not mistaken, either, that the act of bartering with a man whose hands knew the block had changed me. In the past I had kept books so that truth might be preserved. Now I used books as a sieve through which to pass rumor, to introduce hesitancy where certainty had been hungry. When I went home that night, the rain had begun in earnest and the city smelled newly washed, damp hay, wet cobbles, the particular clean of bodies that had hurried. I placed the journeyman's book beneath my ledger, between the pages that held the names I could not unsee. I closed my eyes and saw the guillotine like an abstract problem, an upright solved by motions, a name solved by scheduling, a life solved by the tendency of people to trust lists. I told myself I had not been naive when I first began to copy the manuscript. I had believed that a book that names the dead was destiny. The Ophile had shown me it was workmanship. That knowledge gave me a lever, but a lever used on a city will never be simple. There are weights upon weights. The house was quiet save for the rain, and the slow breathing of a city that had not yet decided whether it would sleep or watch. I unrolled the slip of paper the journeyman had given me again, with the penciled hour that promised the possibility of a deflection. If the schedule was to be used, it would require coordination, a printing that read like authority, and men in the street with hands nimble enough to fold fate into a collar. I thought of Lucy, of Bastien's quick feet, of Tien's plates that had burned. The plan was a mosaic made fragile by the number of hands it required. I slept with the journeyman's book under my pillow and dreamed of ledgers unfurling like sails. There was no comfort in knowledge except the hard comfort that it allowed me to choose what to do next. That thought was itself a burden I took gratefully. At dawn I woke to a sound I had begun to learn, the distant, blunt percussion that marked the day's appointment with mortality. It was not a sound for the faint of heart, a measured knock of wood on air. Yet in that instant, for all the things I had learned and all the plans we could make, the city's mechanisms kept their appetite. I dressed and wrapped the journeyman's book inside a folio and tucked it beneath my arm the way one carries a conscience, now too well informed to be simple. As I stepped into the street, a cart creaked at the corner, and a clerk in a mud-streaked coat shouted the hour. Somewhere along the road the day would decide who it would name first. I folded my hand around the folio and felt its hard edge like an argument. Knowledge had sharpened into a tool. The decision to use it would make a sound and set a motion in the city's machinery. I had the journeyman's ledger. I had the knowledge that the order of things could be altered, that names were placed and sometimes postponed by trivialities. I had also, now, the awareness that to play with those things was to choose some small people's fate, and to leave others at the mercy of happenstance. The problem was no longer an intellectual puzzle. It had become a domestic arithmetic of human cost. When I turned to walk toward the printer's quarter, I saw, across the square, the strip of the tribunal's balcony where a man in a ledger-brown coat stood and watched the market. His profile was unfamiliar. Civic duty gave odd faces to men who had not yet learned to hate their own mirrors. I had the journeyman's book at my side, and with it, a half-broken promise, to learn the city's rhythm well enough to interrupt it. I do not imagine that in that moment I felt like a heroine. There were no trumpets and no neat moral revelation. There was only a woman with a ledger and a book, walking into a morning whose bright light would show the edges of what we had done. The guillotine's line was not altered yet, but in the pocket at my side the journeyman's pencil notes lay like a key. The question that kept me walking was not about whether we could save everyone. It was about who we might be willing to save and what we would pay to do so. The city's drum rolled, and one name would be read that day, whether we moved or not. I had what I needed to make a small change. It remained to be seen whether small changes, added together, would amount to anything like justice. I kept the book close and thought of paper as a seam to unpick. The hook that kept me from sleep that night remained. Knowledge could be used to teach dissent, but the teacher must be careful of his methods. The Ophile had given me an inside to the machine of death. I had accepted it, and in doing so had chosen to move from custodian to participant. The ledger lay heavy and patient in my hand, and I wondered how long it would be before the tribunal noticed that someone had begun to read their columns in the wrong light. The sound of a blade far away and indifferent made me tighten my cloak. The city waited, and so did I. I have a way of measuring danger by the small domestic things that remain unchanged in a city that otherwise seems to rearrange itself each day. Where the milliner's shutters once let in light like a promise, now they clap like lids. where a child's laugh would have lingered above the alley. There is a silence that counts people the way a ledger counts names. I think of these details not as windows on a climate of fear, but as instruments with which the fear is made and held. A bell that rings, a laundress gossip, a ledger misfiled, each of these is a tiny lever. On mornings like the one that begins this chapter, the eaves are sharp with frost, and the city smells of wet straw and dried ink. I sweep the threshold and listen to the street, as if it could be read aloud, the cart at Mummy. P. Rins, the hawker who calls his wares in a voice that chooses no one in particular, footfalls that pass and are gone. Madame Rousseau stands across the lane more often than she used to at first idle curiosity, then a learned vigilance. There is no cruelty in her gaze. It is only habit shaped now into surveillance. She watches my door as a woman might watch a hearth, measuring what warmth remains. I notice that she does not come in. She only reads the spines until they are familiar, then goes about her day with the knowledge she has stored. It is a particular kind of knowledge that troubles me most, not that which announces itself in print, but that which is kept in hand, in the margins, in the habit of delaying a step. Names travel not only on paper but in the slack of a clerk's belt, in the way an officer summons the names on a list. When Commissaire Renaud tightened his ledgered grip, he enrolled 1,000 small hands in his work. Every clerk who collated a list, every executioner who received a schedule, every woman who whispered a name over a drying sheet, they all became nodes in a machine that turned people into mere entries. To untangle that machine, we have had to learn its domestic habits. Jean Morel is one of those habits. He is a man whose face remembers the hard solidties of a life at the front. His jaw carries stories of fatigue. His hands bear the colossus of rope and door latch alike. Yet there is something almost filial about the way he moves in the municipal office, where the administrative mind keeps its spectacles polished. He is not quick to speak, and when he does, his words come like low coins placed with care on a table. He has been our quiet miracle more than once. Perhaps calling it a miracle would be pedantic. Small acts of human error do not require divine intervention. They require only courage or an appetite for taking a risk and making it appear mundane. He met me late one afternoon beneath the arch that leads from the Rue de la Tapisserie to the Records entrance. The light there slants like a blade at that hour. It bevels the edges of faces, makes the city look apprehensive. He put his hand into his coat and offered me a folded scrap of paper. "It was misfiled, mademoiselle," he said. A clerk's hand slipped. "I have set it right where it will not be read before tomorrow." There was a hesitancy in the way he said it, an effort to make what he had done sound accidental. I did not take the scrap for what it seemed. I knew how records were shelved. Folios that might never be seen if stacked in a corner, letters that might be stamped with an official seal, and thus be weightless. When Jean Morel speaks of misfiling, what he means is that he has given someone little more time. Time, in those days, is the only currency of mercy. We spoke then of other things, the way his sister used to press roses in a ledger, the softness of a world that is harder than a stamp. I watched his hands as he smoothed the paper, hands that had once tied knots on ships, now tying small lives into the margins of an administration. "You must be careful," he said, though his voice had the softness of admonition rather than command. And I thought I heard within it that most terrible of sounds, the double-tongued thing that might be warning and consolation at once. Madame Rousseau's role in this tightening net is not to be underestimated. She has always been a neighbor who measured people as one measures flour by eye and feel, but now she has learned, like everyone else, that information can be a salvage. She remembers faces for reasons that exceed gossip. On a morning when the shop's bell had rung and a salesman had left in a hurry, I felt her gaze and realized she had seen the man's hands. Later she told me, with the quickness of a woman who wields memory as weapon, that he had loosened his shawl in the manner of a certain clerk. Her eyes had catalogued a habit, and that cataloguing becomes evidence in a world where evidence counts more than humanity. It is a measure of how close the commissaire's net has become that even the laundries have altered their timetables. Hortense, who brings me scraps of gossip and small changes in the public rhythm, arrived one evening with soap still on her fingers and a face made of small, immediate fear. "They have a new rota," she whispered, and the words in her mouth sounded like linens blown in wind. "The tribunal men have taken to watching nearer the water. They ask after boys who used to sell tangles of ribbon. They count different things now." She folded her hands as if to press some comfort into them, but only found a pocket of empty cloth. "We have learned to listen to such reports as if they were pre-RCs of battle plans. A rota changed at the wash house betrays query routes. A clerk asking strange questions at a registry betrays a new list. A street sweep who pauses to look into a shop window betrays an informant's nervousness. The machine of surveillance grows by recruiting these small acts into its logbook. Our work Tine's plates hidden in his chimney, Bastian's quick transfers, the marginalia soon into spines, is to make other acts of domesticity noiseless. The folding of a paper so that a name reads false if read aloud. The placing of a ledger to the left so that a clerk assumes it is completed and files it away. The misplacement of a detaining order so a man might yet slip a shoe over his foot and leave. I make lists in my head as I mend the seams of books. There are practicalities to everything, the size of the paper that will not arouse suspicion. The ink that will not feather when it rains. The way a false name must be plausible, no revolutionary-sounding sobriquets, but the slow, ordinary names of tradesmen and seamstresses. Tyne taught me how to age a page so it reads as if it had been written months ago. Father Bino T taught me how to choose a confessional handwriting that would look like a tremor rather than a signature. There is art to making a forgery that will be believed, because it reads like the interior life of a clerk, not like a proclamation. And Jean Morel, with his misfiled papers, becomes a thread we can pull. He returns a ledger that had gone astray, and with it brings a week's reprieve for 3 named men. One returns to the shop a week later with a limp, and a story of a long night behind a false name, and a carriage that had been waiting in a lane with hay for concealment. He brings with him the kind of gratitude that is sharpened by fear. He is deferential when he visits the counter, buys a single book on herbal cures, and sits as if he has not been near a tribunal at all. Mercy leaves marks like Colossus. I can see them on his thumb when he fingers the spine of the book. Yet every small mercy ripples outward. The machine notices anomalies, a ledger returned to a shelf it should not occupy, a clerk who pauses too long in a corridor, a name that does not appear where it ought to. Renaud's men begin to watch the printers and the booksellers with new attention. A municipal agent begins to take interest in which customers slip out with 2 parcels rather than 1. Madame Rousseau's gaze sharpens, she begins to annotate in her head, and she has friends at the market who will carry a tale to a clerk who does not know she is a friend of a bookseller. It is here that the tension between duty and conscience reveals itself not in speeches, but in habits. Jean Morel cannot overthrow the tribunal, and he knows the shape of punishment better than many. Yet he misfiles. He leaves a ledger where a casual hand might miss it. When soldiers come to the records, he petitions a clerk to stay late, and when they open the registry he produces a volume that seems to have been mislaid. The work piles up, he says again, an attempt at making the deliberate appear inevitable. Another time he will sign an order that undoes a small harm. Each act threatens to be the last he can afford to perform. We have had other scares. Tyne's press was nearly discovered when a municipal inspector turned up unexpectedly in the lane, asking for a bill for type. Tien recognized the glint in the inspector's eye, not just curiosity, but a hunger for control. He had stammered about an order that was owed to a merchant, and had the strange presence of mind to show the man a fulsome ledger of fake orders, an almanac of shipments, all typeset to distract. The inspector had left, satisfied with his paper, and later the plate of the most dangerous list had been burned in the hearth with the solemnity of an offering. It is not heroism that saved them, but the practiced anatomy of deception. Yet deception is costly. Tyne's hands smell of smoke and sacrifice. He has lost plates that were part of his living, and the act of burning type is like burning part of oneself. He looks thinner now, and there is a new keenness to his jaw that is less about resolve and more about resignation. When I warm my hands at his press, their heat feels borrowed from a life he is willing to burn. Hortense brings tidings that set the room crackling. "They have taken to asking after Bastien," she says, and her eyes move to the stair, as if she expects him to appear and to take their lives on his shoulders. Bastien, who once sold pamphlets for a coin, has become our fleet foot. He moves with a careful hubris, a child's recklessness wrapped in the seasoned craft of a street hawker. When his name is being inquired after, we know a nerve has been struck. We take measures. Lucy learns new routes. She wears one of my brother's old coats, so she might pass for a woman running a household. She tucks leaflets into loaves that a baker takes off at the market, and Bastien arranges for a girl he knows to carry a message meant for a rival printer. We practice the small choreography of evasion until it becomes second nature, the exchange of a coin that is actually a signal, the folding of a list into a newspaper so ordinary that no one will read it twice. At night I sit at my counter with my ledger and the marginalia we have collected. Father Benotis' notes are there, references to how lists are compiled in the tribunal and to the clerks who assemble them. His script is steady, as if confession writes the hand of a man who has learned to compress sin into a line. I write my own small notes in the margins, how to alter an index so that a woman's name slides down a page by a clerk's hand, how to place a false signature in the lower corner so a reader assumes legitimacy. When the shop is quiet, the city seems to press on the panes, as if it wants to come inside and rearrange the bookshelves according to some legid sense of order. There are nights when fear tastes of metal, and the shop's lamplight throws the letters of my title page into yellowed constellations on the ceiling. I think of the ledger as an animal that breathes in names. To breathe against it is to place one's mouth near its gullet. The risk is not only for the printers and those we protect, it is for those we love. Lucy, for all her impatience and flame, wants to save the young men who shout the slogans in the square. Tyne wants to save the sister he lost. Bastien wants to be more than a courier. Their motives mix like inks when one hand is not careful, and still the machine tightens. There are new informers, faces unknown, who linger by the market and listen to the rhythm of our trade. A clerk who used to be harmless now watches the shop window with the ensemble of a man trying to complete an inventory of lives. Madame Rousseau approaches with the economy of a woman bearing a message. She taps the counter with a knuckle and never speaks the parts of the news that would endanger. She tells me that Renaud has been seen near the dock, that he has taken to reading registry lists on his way to the office, that he carries his own quill like a talisman. In the end we count what we have: time, false names, the pliancy of an official's patience. For every misfiled order Jean Morel can manage, there will be another clerk whose conscience is short-circuited by fear. For every burned plate there is an informer ready to barter a name for bread. The ledger's weight presses like snow on the roof. It is not one decisive blow that will break us, but the slow piling up of small things that make escape impossible: a door nailed, a ledger misplaced, a watchful neighbor. But we press our own small resistances into seams. I sew marginalia into prayer books and seam them there as if by accident. I tell a story in the guttering light of the shop about how a clerk once misplaced a sermon and how the congregation forgave him because of it. It is a story meant to teach the art of misplacement as a gospel of mercy. That night I patch a binding and tuck inside it a note of 3 names altered so that the tribunal will be forced to check twice where they would only glance once. It is a small arithmetic of delay, possibly enough to let a pair of feet disappear into a crowd, or to let a